I had been traveling alone for a few days, enjoying the quiet moments that came with being away from the bustle of everyday life. I found a cute Airbnb in a small town. It was tucked away in a neighborhood where the houses were close to each other, but it felt like a peaceful escape from everything. The listing had plenty of glowing reviews. People talked about how cozy it was, how the host was kind, and how the place had a certain charm to it. Everything seemed perfect. The moment I arrived, I was greeted with a warm message from the host, asking if I needed anything or had any questions. I hadn't traveled much before, and it felt reassuring to have someone so communicative. The house itself was an old, two-story place with a lot of character, creaky floors, old wooden windows, and antique furniture that gave it an almost nostalgic feel. The room I was staying in was upstairs, at the end of a narrow hallway. It had a large bed with a quilt that looked like it had been stitched together by someone's grandmother. The dresser in the corner was one of those old, heavy types that creaked every time you touched it. It was beautiful, but I immediately noticed one of the drawers wouldn't open. It was the second one down, and no matter how much I tugged on it, it stayed firmly shut. I didn't think much of it. I was in a small town, looking forward to relaxing and seeing the sights, and I didn't want to spend any more time on a drawer that wouldn't open. I asked the host about it in passing, and they quickly explained that it was broken, not to worry about it, and that it wasn't important anyway. I figured it was just some old piece of furniture that hadn't been maintained properly, and I left it at that. The first few days were peaceful. I explored the town, visited a few local shops, and enjoyed the calm. But one night, when I was back in my room, something odd happened. I was getting ready to settle in for bed, and as I turned to face the mirror, I bumped into the dresser. It wasn't a hard bump, just enough to jostle it slightly, but something unexpected happened. The drawer that had been stuck, the one that the host had assured me was broken, slid open on its own. I froze for a moment, staring at it. I didn't know what to think. My mind immediately tried to rationalize it. Maybe it wasn't as broken as I had been led to believe. Maybe the bump just shifted something inside, and now it was loose. But deep down, a small part of me felt uneasy. There was something wrong about it. The drawer was empty except for a small, leather-bound diary. It was locked shut with a tiny brass clasp, and there was no key in sight. I picked it up, my fingers brushing against the worn edges. It was old, but the leather felt surprisingly smooth. It didn't look like something that belonged in this room, in this Airbnb. It felt out of place. Without thinking, I turned the diary over in my hands, and that's when I saw it. On the back cover, scrawled in faint, almost unreadable handwriting, were the words, "Help me, if you find this." My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the message for what felt like a long time, unsure of what to do. Was it a prank? A note left by a previous guest? Or something else entirely? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was holding something important, something that wasn't meant for me to find. I took a photo of the message and the diary, then immediately tried to message the host. I felt like I needed to know what this was, and I wanted to ask if they knew anything about it. Maybe it was some weird decoration left by a previous guest, or perhaps it had been misplaced by someone. But as I reached for my phone, I realized something strange was happening. The Airbnb app was acting up. It took a moment for the app to load, and when it finally did, it was showing a notification that my account had been frozen for suspicious activity. I stared at the screen in confusion. I had been a loyal user of Airbnb for years. There was nothing suspicious about my account, but the more I tried to log back in, the more errors popped up. I was locked out. My account was inaccessible. I didn't know what to think. Was this a glitch? Had something happened with my payment method? I tried restarting my phone, but the app still wouldn't work. I went to bed that night with the diary next to me, feeling uneasy and unsure of what to do. The next morning, things only got stranger. I woke up early, hoping the issue would be resolved. I went to the living room, where I could use the house's Wi-Fi to check my email and try to get back into my account. But as soon as I logged into my email, I noticed something odd. There were several unread messages from the host, all sent in the middle of the night. I opened the first one, and my stomach sank. The message was short, but it was unsettling. "I noticed you took something from the room. Please return it immediately." I had no idea what they meant. I hadn't taken anything else from the room besides the diary, and it wasn't like I had stolen it. I had found it, and I didn't know what to do. I wasn't about to return it without understanding what it was, but the tone of the message felt threatening. I thought about replying, but I hesitated. The app was still frozen, and I couldn't send anything. So instead, I decided to drive to a local coffee shop to get some space and think it through. Maybe I could get some answers. As I left the house, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The house, which had seemed so inviting and cozy at first, now looked almost eerie in the daylight. The windows seemed darker than they had been when I arrived, and the yard was unusually quiet. The street outside, usually full of life, was empty. The silence felt oppressive, as though something was waiting. I didn't want to be there anymore. I went to the coffee shop, sat down with a cup of coffee, and tried to relax. But I couldn't stop thinking about the diary and the note. I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that my Airbnb account had been locked, and I couldn't access anything to resolve it. I was stuck. When I returned to the house, I found the door to the bedroom open. The room had been untouched, but the drawer was closed again. I wasn't sure if I had closed it before I left, but the feeling in my gut told me that I hadn't. It was the strangest thing, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things in a hurry, my mind racing. I didn't want to confront the host. I didn't want to explain what had happened. The last thing I wanted was to be in the middle of something I didn't understand. As I was leaving, I tried to open the Airbnb app one more time. Still wouldn't work. My account was still locked, and there were no responses to my messages. I left the keys on the kitchen counter, made sure everything was packed, and walked out the door. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, waiting for me to leave. A few days passed, and the app never unlocked. My account was still frozen, and the host never responded to any of my attempts to reach out. I never heard from them again. I don't know what happened in that house. I don't know who left that diary or why it was there, but I know that the feeling I had in that room, something was off, something wasn't right, was not just in my head. There was something wrong with that place, and I'm glad I left when I did. I don't think I'll ever understand what I found, but I don't think I need to. The diary and its message are enough of a warning. And that locked account is still frozen. I haven't been able to access it since that night. I had been traveling for work, staying in Airbnbs across different cities for a couple of weeks, and everything was going smoothly. The place I'd booked for that night seemed nice. Pictures showed a cozy little apartment with modern furniture, a small kitchen, and a clean, simple design. The host had good reviews, and everything seemed perfectly normal. So, after a long day of meetings and dealing with a bunch of client emails, I was looking forward to getting into the apartment, dropping my stuff, and just relaxing for the evening. The location was good, tucked into a quiet neighborhood just outside the busy part of town. It was an older building but had been renovated, so everything inside was new and fresh. I didn't have trouble getting in. The keyless entry system worked fine, and I was inside within minutes. After settling in and making sure the Wi-Fi worked, important, since I had some work to do later, I kicked off my shoes and made myself at home. Around 10 p.m., I started getting tired. I wasn't planning on doing much. Maybe watch a couple of episodes of something on Netflix and get an early night. I'd had a long day, and all I wanted was some peace. The apartment had a small living area with a couch, so I threw myself on it, grabbed the remote, and started scrolling through shows. About an hour later, I heard the sound of keys in the door, followed by a click, and then the door opened. I froze, confused for a second. I wasn't expecting anyone. My heart skipped a beat because, as far as I knew, I was the only one booked for that night. The door hadn't been locked, but the system shouldn't have allowed someone else to get in. At least, I didn't think it should. The man stood there for a moment, his hand still on the doorknob. He was wearing a black jacket and carrying a small rolling suitcase. For a split second, we just stared at each other. His face showed no surprise, which was unsettling. I mean, I thought I was the only one here. He stood in the doorway for what felt like forever, and I could barely make myself move, just too stunned to speak. I finally managed to clear my throat. "Who are you?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the room, as if taking in the space before he said something. "I'm here to stay. The host said I could check in tonight." The words didn't fully register at first. I blinked at him, still not fully understanding. "What do you mean?" I asked, even though I already had a sinking feeling in my stomach. "The host told me I could stay. She double-booked the unit, but I'm supposed to be here." I felt my pulse speed up. "What? No, that's not possible. I'm booked for tonight." She didn't tell me anything about that. I tried to keep my voice steady, but there was panic beginning to creep into my words. The man just nodded slowly, not acting weird, but his expression was neutral, almost too calm. "Yeah, she didn't tell you, I guess, but she told me I'd be here tonight. I'm supposed to stay. It's no problem, right?" He shifted his bag from one hand to the other, the sound of the wheels squeaking loudly in the silence. "I just need to put my stuff down, just for a bit." I wasn't sure what to do. My instinct was to tell him to leave, but it felt strange. The fact that he seemed so casual about it made me hesitant. What if it was just a misunderstanding? Maybe the host had genuinely made a mistake, and he was just confused about the booking. Still, something wasn't sitting right. I hadn't been warned about a double booking. The air felt tense, like the room was closing in around me. I stood there frozen for a moment, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. It's not that I didn't trust people, but something felt off, especially the way he was acting. He didn't seem shocked or apologetic, just matter-of-fact, like this was some normal thing that happened all the time. The silence stretched out, and I was desperately trying to think of something to do. I knew I needed to get out of there, but I couldn't bring myself to leave yet. I wanted to hear what he had to say. My heart was pounding, but I was trying to act calm, trying to sound like I wasn't totally freaked out. "You can't stay here. I'm booked for tonight, and there must be some mistake," I said again, but my voice came out a little shaky. He gave a shrug, then placed his suitcase by the door. "Like I said, the host told me I could stay. Don't worry about it." The way he said it, it wasn't just a casual statement. There was something about his tone, something cold and direct, that made my stomach drop. It wasn't the words themselves, but the feeling behind them. He wasn't apologizing for the mix-up. It was almost like he was claiming the space like he belonged there, like I was the one who didn't belong. I took a step back, instinctively placing a hand on my phone, as though that would somehow protect me. He didn't seem to notice. His eyes moved briefly over me, then shifted to the rest of the apartment again. His gaze lingered for a moment too long, and that's when the unease really started to sink in. I wanted to grab my bag and leave immediately, but I also didn't want to make any sudden moves and escalate things. "Are you really staying alone?" he asked, almost casually, as though it were just a normal question. I paused, unsure how to answer. Something in the way he asked it made me feel exposed, vulnerable, like he was probing for more information. I didn't know if it was just my paranoia kicking in, but it felt like there was more to that question than just idle curiosity. "Yeah," I replied, a little too quickly. "I'm staying alone." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "All right, well, I guess I'll just be here for the night then." He started to move toward the kitchen, not in a hurry, but deliberately. "I won't bother you." I didn't want to be there anymore. I didn't trust him, and I wasn't about to stick around to see if he'd do anything strange. He was being polite, but the tension was suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't know if he was dangerous or if he was just awkward, but I wasn't willing to take any chances. I grabbed my things, my laptop, my phone, and a few essentials, and started to head toward the door. I didn't want to be confrontational, but I knew I had to leave. I wasn't going to stay in the same apartment with someone I didn't know, especially not after the way he'd acted. He watched me, his gaze shifting just slightly. "You sure you're all right?" he asked, his tone too soft, almost patronizing. I didn't respond. I just walked toward the door. I could feel my hands shaking, but I forced myself to remain steady. I didn't even want to look at him anymore. My mind was racing as I stepped out into the hallway. I didn't even care if he was actually booked to stay there. Something felt so off about the whole situation. The way he had asked about me being alone, the way he hadn't reacted when I told him I was booked, it was all too much. I reached for my phone and called a nearby hotel, booking a room just down the street. I couldn't stay there any longer, not after that conversation. As I waited for confirmation, I glanced back at the apartment. I didn't know if he was still inside, but I wasn't about to check. Within 15 minutes, I was at the hotel. I got checked in and into my room without any issues. I felt my shoulders finally relax as I locked the door behind me. As I sat on the edge of the bed, I replayed the whole thing in my head. The guy's strange behavior, the fact that the host hadn't told me about the double booking, and especially the way he'd asked if I was really staying alone. It was too much of a coincidence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made the right choice in leaving. I didn't get any sleep that night. My mind kept racing, trying to make sense of it all. But I was safe, and that was what mattered. The next morning, I contacted the host about the mix-up. I didn't get a reply until later in the day, but when she did, she apologized for the confusion. She claimed she'd accidentally double-booked and that she hadn't realized someone else was already there. I didn't buy it. The whole thing seemed too convenient, too perfectly timed. I didn't ask for my money back. It didn't matter. The experience had been enough to make me rethink using AIRBNBs again for a while. Some things just don't feel right, no matter how hard you try to convince yourself otherwise. And that night is one I'll never forget. I had never stayed in an Airbnb before, and if I'm being honest, I wasn't exactly thrilled about it. I'm not some fancy hotel kind of person, but the price for the Airbnb was unbeatable. It was out in the woods, the kind of place where you'd expect quiet nights and maybe a few deer wandering around. Perfect for some peace and quiet, or so I thought. I got there late in the afternoon, the sun already starting to dip behind the trees. The place wasn't much to look at from the outside. Just a small house with a faded red door and a wooden porch. But it was secluded, which was exactly what I was looking for. I was staying here for a few days on my own, trying to clear my head. There were no neighbors for miles, just miles and miles of trees, which felt like the perfect escape from the noise of the city. The inside of the house was cozy, like a cabin in the woods. There was a large living room with an old, worn-out couch and a couple of mismatched armchairs. The walls were lined with bookshelves full of old novels and some weird little knickknacks. The kitchen was small but functional, with basic appliances and a rustic vibe to it. It wasn't exactly modern, but it had character, you know? There was also a little bathroom off the hallway, and 2 bedrooms upstairs. One I claimed for myself, the other looked like it had been untouched for years. I unpacked my stuff, settled in, and made a quick dinner. It was still light out, but I figured I'd watch something on TV before heading to bed. That's when it first happened. I turned on the TV in the living room, picked out a random movie, and sat down on the couch. Everything was fine for the first few minutes, just background noise while I ate and relaxed. But then, around 11:30, the screen flickered. It wasn't a full-on glitch, just a little odd, like the image was trying to adjust itself. I didn't think much of it. I'd seen TVs do weird things before, but then it happened again. This time, it wasn't the picture, just the sound. The volume dropped way down and static filled the air. I thought maybe I had bumped the remote or something, but when I looked down, it was lying flat on the coffee table, not near my hand. The static lasted a few seconds, then cut to a low, almost imperceptible whispering. I turned up the volume, thinking it was part of the show, but no, it was coming from the TV itself, even though the movie was still running. At first, I thought maybe I was just tired, or maybe there was something wrong with the TV. I pressed the mute button, but it didn't stop. The whispering was still there, faint, like someone was talking just below the threshold of hearing. Words were there, but they didn't make sense. They didn't sound like anything I could understand. Felt wrong. I picked up the remote and tried to turn it off, but it wouldn't respond. The screen was still on, and the whispering continued. I unplugged it. I pulled the cord out of the wall socket. Silence. I stood there for a second, just listening to the dead quiet of the room. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was just tired from the drive. But no, I wasn't. I knew what I heard. It wasn't my imagination. I turned to leave the room, but then the TV flicked back on. I don't know how. I didn't touch it, but there it was, glowing in the dark, the same low volume, the same static-filled whispering. I froze, staring at it, my stomach churning. Felt wrong, unnatural. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to think about what could be going on. But it didn't feel like some glitch or electrical issue. It felt intentional, like something was playing tricks on me. I unplugged the TV again, but this time I wasn't leaving the living room. I threw a towel over it, the kind of thick, heavy towel you use when you're at the beach. I didn't want to see the screen again, didn't want to hear that whispering anymore. I sat down on the couch, trying to calm myself, but my heart was pounding. There was something off about the whole thing. I decided to go to bed, hoping that a good night's sleep would make everything feel better. But I couldn't sleep. I couldn't get comfortable. The towel was still draped over the TV, but in the silence of the room, I could still hear that whispering, faint but constant, like a hum in the background of my mind. I couldn't tell if it was just my nerves or if the noise was still there, lingering, but I wasn't about to go back into the living room to check. My thoughts were racing, but I eventually managed to fall asleep, only to wake up a few hours later. The whispering was louder now, almost like it was right next to my ear. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to ignore it, but it wouldn't go away. It was like a pressure in the air, like something was pressing in on me. I couldn't take it anymore. I yanked the towel off the TV, but it was just static. Nothing but static. No whispering, no voices, just white noise, like I was standing at the edge of some radio station where the signal was lost. I turned the TV off manually and, this time, left the remote on the coffee table. I grabbed my headphones and plugged them into my phone, cranking up the volume to drown out everything else. I needed some peace. I fell asleep with the headphones in, finally getting some rest, though it was uneasy, like I was waiting for something to happen. The night passed without incident, and when I woke up in the morning, everything seemed normal, almost too normal. I made some coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, trying to shake off the weird feeling. But it didn't go away. The unease stayed with me, lingering like a bad taste. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. I had planned on staying another night, but after the events of the previous night, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my stuff and left early, making sure to lock the door behind me. When I got home, I left a review of the place. I mentioned the TV incident, the static, the whispering, and how I had to sleep with headphones in just to get any rest. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I felt like I needed to warn other people. I wasn't trying to make a big deal of it, but it felt wrong. Like I'd been staying in a place that wasn't exactly right. A few days later, I saw someone else's comment on my review. Same thing happened to me, they wrote. They didn't elaborate further, but the words hit me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't crazy. Someone else had heard it too. Someone else had experienced the same thing I had. I don't know what was going on with that TV, but I wasn't going to stay there again. I didn't feel like I was alone in that house. Maybe it was just an electrical issue, but something about it felt off. I wasn't about to try and figure it out. I had enough. I didn't check back on that Airbnb again. I didn't want to know if it happened to anyone else. I just wanted to forget about it, to move on. I think I'll stick to hotels from now on. If you stay in a place like that, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. I wish I had listened to mine sooner. I had been traveling for work, and after a long day of meetings, I found myself in a city I didn't know at all. I was trying to make the best of it by staying in an Airbnb I had booked for the night. The place seemed nice enough from the pictures. An older building but well-maintained, with a nice top-floor unit that looked comfortable and cozy. I figured it'd be a good place to rest my head for a couple of nights before heading back home. The unit was on the 3rd floor, and the building itself had a lot of character. The hallway smelled faintly of wood polish, and the hardwood floors creaked with every step I took. I liked it, It had that lived-in feel, the kind that made you feel like you were in someone else's world for a little while. The apartment was small but charming, with soft lighting and cozy furniture. The bedroom had a big window with a nice view of the city below. I unpacked my stuff, stretched out on the bed, and went to sleep, the sound of the occasional car passing by below the only noise filling the silence of the night. It was around 4 a.m. when I woke up. At first, it was just a vague feeling, a slight discomfort, like something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I shifted on the bed, still half asleep, trying to figure out what was bugging me. My eyes weren't fully open, but I could see the outlines of the room in the dim moonlight spilling through the window. Then I saw it. There, right against the window, was a face. A pale, distorted face, pressed up against the glass. I didn't move at first. Couldn't. I was frozen, staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The face was so close, so impossibly close to the window, that I could see the details in the moonlight. I could make out the features, the dark eyes, the thin lips. The face didn't look distorted in a way that made it look like it wasn't human. No, it was human, but it was wrong. It was wrong in a way that I couldn't explain at the time, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. I blinked hard, thinking I was still dreaming, but when I opened my eyes again, it was still there. I felt my chest tighten, my heart racing, and my stomach churned with fear. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was as if the room itself had become a trap, the walls closing in around me. The face didn't move, but I felt like it was staring directly at me, watching me in the silence of the room. My mind raced. Was someone out there? How could they even be there? The window was too high up, there was no balcony, no ledge, just a sheer drop. I had checked the building before I went to bed, and I knew there was nothing that could explain how someone could have gotten that close to the window without falling to their death. My hands were shaking by the time I managed to force myself to move. My legs felt like lead as I swung them off the bed and stood up. I reached for the light switch, my fingers trembling as I flipped it on. The moment the light hit the room, the face disappeared. I blinked again, disoriented, my breath still coming in shallow gasps. The window was empty. Nothing was there. I rushed to the window, yanked open the blinds, and looked outside. Nothing. Just the dark city below, lit by the faint glow of streetlights. There was no one, no sign of anyone, not even the faintest movement. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared out into the night, trying to make sense of what had just happened. There was no logical explanation for it. The face had been right there, pressed against the glass. And then, the moment the light came on, it was gone. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered in the air. It felt like something was wrong, like something was watching me. I went back to bed, pulling the covers tight around me, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face again. Every time I opened them, I half expected to see it there in the window again. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the building, every shift in the wind, made me jump. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, drained by fear and anxiety. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe I had just imagined it. Maybe I was still half asleep, or maybe it was a trick of the light. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. When the sunlight finally streamed through the window, I forced myself to get up. I had a few things to do that day, and I couldn't let myself stay in the apartment, spiraling into my own thoughts. But as I stood by the window, looking out at the city, I noticed something. There were faint smudges on the glass. At first, I thought I was seeing things, but when I looked closer, I saw them clearly. Small, dark smudges, as if someone had pressed their hands against the window. There were two, right where the face had been the night before. I froze. There was no way that could have been me. I hadn't touched the window. I hadn't even gotten that close to it. And the smudges didn't look like they had come from the inside of the apartment. They were on the outside where no one could have possibly been, unless of course they had climbed up to that window somehow. But even then, how could they have been so precise, pressing their hands against the glass without leaving any marks anywhere else? I felt a wave of nausea hit me as I stepped back from the window, my mind racing to understand what had happened. There was no rational explanation. No one had been able to get that close to the window without causing a scene or making noise. The building was quiet at night. No one would have been able to sneak up that high without anyone noticing. The idea that someone had been outside, so close to me, made my skin crawl. The rest of the morning was a blur. I packed my bags quickly, unable to stay in the apartment any longer. I didn't even take the time to fully process everything. I just wanted to leave. I left the Airbnb key on the table and locked the door behind me, hoping to never think about it again. But as I walked down the street, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My eyes darted around, constantly scanning my surroundings. I wasn't sure if I was paranoid or if something had really happened that night. Either way, I had to get out of that building. I never went back, not even to pick up my things. I did some quick research on the building after I left. It was an old building, but there was nothing in the history of it that explained anything out of the ordinary. No past incidents, no strange reports. It was just a normal place in a normal part of town. But I never forgot that face. I never forgot the smudges on the window or the feeling of someone watching me through the glass. I still think about it sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet. I wonder if someone was really out there, or if it was just a trick of the mind. I don't know if I'll ever have an answer to that. But I've learned one thing for sure. Sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones you can see. They're the ones you can't explain. I had been looking forward to the Airbnb I booked. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway in a small, cozy house far from the noise of the city. I wanted peace and solitude, a break from everything. I found this place through the app after scrolling for a while, liking the pictures of its charming vintage decor. The house was located in a remote part of the country, nestled among trees. The price was decent for a few days and the reviews were great, so I thought it would be perfect. The owner, a woman in her late 30s, was friendly enough with a decent rating, so I didn't think twice about it. When I arrived, the house had a homely feel, a little run down but not in a way that made it uncomfortable. On the first day, everything was fine. The kitchen had old wood cabinets with a few chips in the paint, the kind that made the place feel like it had a history. The fridge was stocked with a few basics: milk, eggs, butter. There was an old-fashioned stove with a creaky oven. The floors creaked when you walked, but I liked that it gave the house character. I spent the day unpacking, exploring the place a bit, and getting comfortable. The living room was cozy, with a couple of mismatched couches and a fireplace that didn't look like it had been used in years. A window overlooked the overgrown backyard, where the grass was tall and wild. I cooked some dinner and then just relaxed, watching TV until I fell asleep in one of the bedrooms. The house felt quiet, peaceful. First, it was everything I wanted. But the next day, things started to feel off. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I noticed something strange. There was a shelf built into the wall right next to the counter. It was a simple thing, just a small wooden shelf with a few jars of spices, a couple of coffee mugs, and a few utensils. I hadn't thought much about it before, but that morning, as I stood there stirring my coffee, I noticed a strange indentation in the wall behind it. The wood of the shelf seemed a bit worn, and there was a faint outline of a door, or at least something that looked like a door, hidden behind the shelf. The more I looked at it, the more I realized that it wasn't just the shelf that was old. It was the wall too. The outline was definitely there, barely visible but unmistakable. My curiosity piqued. I set my mug down and stepped closer. I gently pulled the shelf away from the wall. It was heavier than I expected, but once it was out of the way, I could see the door more clearly. It was a small, narrow door, almost hidden in the corner. The wood was old and chipped, the kind that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. It had no doorknob, just a small latch at the top. I stared at it for a while, wondering if it was just some kind of odd storage closet, maybe a pantry or a small utility room. I wasn't sure, but the door was clearly not meant to be noticed, tucked away so neatly behind the shelf. After a few moments of hesitation, I reached for the latch and pulled it open. What I found inside was nothing like what I expected. The room was tiny, barely big enough for a person to lie down in, with just a single mattress on the floor. It wasn't a bed, just a thin mattress, yellowed and worn with age. There was nothing else inside. No furniture, no shelves, nothing. The walls were bare, except for something that made my stomach drop. On one of the walls, someone had written names. Dozens of names. They were scratched into the wood, almost like they had been carved with a sharp object. I couldn't make out every single name. It was too dark in the room. But one thing stood out: dates. Next to each name was a date, as if someone was keeping track of something or someone. And then I saw it. My name. Written in the middle of the wall in uneven, jagged letters was my name, followed by the date I checked in. The exact day. I froze. I stood there for a long time, staring at the wall, my mind racing. How was it possible that my name was written there? Had the previous guests done this? Felt too strange, too personal. I had never seen this room before, so how could my name have been written on the wall before I even entered? The door had been hidden. The place seemed normal when I checked in, but now something about it felt wrong. Very wrong. I took a step back, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was just some weird decoration or an art project left by previous guests. I didn't know, but the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. I closed the door, moved the shelf back into place, and tried to shake it off. It was probably nothing. I went about the rest of my day, but I couldn't stop thinking about that tiny room. There was something about it that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just the names or the strange feeling that something was off. It was the fact that the room had been hidden, and my name had been written there, as if it had been waiting for me. I tried to focus on the peacefulness of the house, but that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence of the house felt suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside made my heart race. I kept thinking about the room, about the names on the wall. Had someone been tracking people who stayed here? Or worse, had they been watching? I couldn't tell myself that it was just a coincidence anymore. I felt like I was being pulled into something, like I had stumbled into a place where I didn't belong. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't stay another night in that house. I didn't even want to look at the hidden door again. As I was grabbing my things, I noticed something strange on the kitchen counter. One of the receipts from the drawer, crumpled up, with my name written on it, dated the day before I checked in. It was like someone had been keeping track of me, of all the people who came through this house. I didn't want to think about it any longer. I grabbed my bags, made sure I hadn't left anything behind, and walked out the door. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the first person to be trapped in that place. I didn't know what was going on, but I wasn't going to find out. I left before sundown, and I never looked back. When I got home, I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. I told myself it was just a weird experience, nothing more. But then, a few days later, I got an email from the Airbnb host. It was a simple message, asking if I had enjoyed my stay and if I had any feedback. I almost didn't reply, but something made me click on the message. There was a second line, buried at the bottom of the email. It read, "I hope you found the room to your liking." I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. There was no way the host could have known about the hidden room, not unless they had been there watching. I didn't respond to the email. Instead, I closed the app and deleted the booking from my history. But every once in a while, I find myself checking the app again, looking at that house, the place with the hidden door, the place where my name was written on the wall. I haven't been able to forget about it, and I don't think I ever will. I had rented a cabin through Airbnb up in the mountains. It was a quiet little place, tucked away on a dirt road that seemed to go on forever, far from the nearest town. It was the kind of spot you'd expect to see in an ad for Get Away From It All. The host's description was everything you'd hope for in a secluded getaway. Charming, cozy, and private. They listed all the amenities, but it was the nature that really caught my attention. Tall trees, fresh air, and the peaceful silence that felt like it was a world away from everything. I needed a break from the city, so this sounded perfect. When I first arrived, everything was as expected. The cabin was small, a single story with wooden beams and big windows that let in the daylight. It smelled like pine and cedar, with a fireplace that crackled when I lit it. The place was well maintained, with soft, inviting furniture and a warm bed that seemed to promise a good night's sleep. There were no neighbors for miles, and aside from the occasional bird or rustle of the wind in the trees, the place was utterly quiet. The first night passed without incident. The only sound in the air was the distant call of an owl, and I slept deeply after the long drive. But it was the second night that things started to get strange. It happened around 1 a.m. I had just drifted off to sleep when I was jolted awake by a noise, a high-pitched wail that made my blood run cold. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't wind or the sound of creaky pipes. It was a human-like scream, distant but somehow piercing. My eyes shot open, heart racing, and I lay frozen in the dark. The sound seemed to come from the walls, as if someone was trapped inside, trying to scream but being muffled by the thick wood and insulation. I lay there for a few minutes, straining to hear, but the scream had stopped as quickly as it began. My pulse was still hammering, but I chalked it up to some weird noise from the house. Maybe the plumbing or the wind. It was an old cabin, after all. So, I tried to go back to sleep, but the noise had left me uneasy, like a shadow hanging over me. The next night, the same thing happened, only this time it was louder. The scream echoed through the walls, longer, more desperate, almost like someone was gasping for air in the middle of it. It was unmistakable. This was no house settling or creaky pipes. Felt real. I had my phone with me and I decided to record it to try to capture the sound so I could prove it was happening. I set it on the bedside table and hit record. The phone's mic picked up a few faint noises, but nothing like what I was hearing. The scream, that horrible wail, was completely absent in the recording. I went back to listen to the audio, but it came out silent, just a quiet buzz, nothing more. I tried again the next night, certain that the phone had just messed up somehow. But once again, the same thing happened. The phone recorded nothing. I even tried leaving it in the kitchen the following night, hoping it would pick up the noise if it was coming from the plumbing. But still nothing. The air felt thick with the unsaid, a sense of dread hanging over everything. I began to feel like the walls themselves were watching me. The air in the cabin felt different, heavy in a way I couldn't explain. I started looking through the reviews of the place, hoping maybe someone else had experienced what I was hearing. To my surprise, other guests had mentioned something similar. They spoke about strange noises in the night, screams that echoed through the cabin and rattled the pipes. Some people thought it was just an old house settling, but others were clearly unnerved, much like I was. No one, however, had received any response from the host when they mentioned the noises. That struck me as odd. A responsible host would respond to that, right? But there was nothing, no apology, no explanation, just silence. As the days passed, the noise continued, every night at exactly 1 a.m. The longer I stayed, the more on edge I became. I had started to leave lights on at night, just to make me feel better, though it did little to calm my growing unease. I tried to keep my mind busy during the day, hiking the trails nearby, reading, and even taking photos of the beautiful surroundings, but it didn't help. Every time I returned to the cabin, I could feel the uneasiness creeping back. I was dreading the night. I considered leaving, but I'd already paid for the stay, and the place was otherwise perfect, except for the screaming. I convinced myself that I was being paranoid, that it was all in my head, maybe even stress from the city that was manifesting as fear. But then, one night, it happened again, and this time it was different. The scream wasn't just a wail anymore. It was followed by a loud thud, like something heavy hitting the floor. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened as the silence stretched on. The room felt impossibly still, like the house itself was holding its breath. I grabbed my phone and tried recording again, praying this time it would work. But when I pressed play on the recording, there was nothing, not a sound. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the dark. My skin was crawling, and I could feel the tension in the air, thick, suffocating. The kitchen lights flickered slightly as I passed, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stood still for a moment, listening. Silence. I started to walk back to the bedroom when I heard a noise. A soft rustling, like someone shuffling around in the walls. It was faint, but it was there. Suddenly, everything went still again. I was too terrified to move, too frozen in the dark to do anything. I just stood there, staring at the walls, listening. And then, there it was again. The scream, sharp and clear, like a person calling out for help. But then it was cut off abruptly, as if someone had smothered it with their hands. Couldn't breathe. The noise was coming from inside the walls. My stomach churned with dread. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to stay, but I had no idea what to do next. The nearest town was an hour away. The host didn't respond to messages, and I had no one to call. I had no choice but to stay in that cabin one more night. The next morning, I decided to try something. I needed to figure out what was causing this, or at least prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I took a few pictures of the cabin, the walls, the pipes, anything that might give me some kind of answer. I even checked under the cabin to see if there were any signs of wildlife, though I didn't expect to find anything. That's when I found it. Near the back of the house, under a small wooden panel that looked like it had been replaced recently, I discovered something strange. Plastic tubing. It looked new, out of place. When I pulled at it, I realized it was attached to the water supply. It wasn't just plumbing, it was a makeshift setup. There was something about it that didn't sit right, so I pulled it out, following the tubing through the floorboards. The further I traced it, the more I realized that it wasn't leading to any proper pipes or plumbing systems. It seemed to be routed into the walls themselves, underneath the floor, out of sight. I could barely believe what I was seeing. This was no accidental noise, it was intentional. Someone had designed this strange system to create a sound, to make it seem like someone was trapped or in pain. The scream, the wail that had been haunting me, was the result of someone manipulating the water pressure in a way that made it sound like a person was screaming from within the walls. The more I looked, the more I realized that this whole setup had been designed to freak people out, to make them feel uncomfortable, to make them want to leave. Couldn't believe it. The host had known about the noise. They'd seen the reviews. They hadn't answered because they didn't care. This was a deliberate setup, a way to make people think they were losing their minds. I packed my bags that day, left the cabin, and went straight to the nearest town. I called the Airbnb customer support line and reported everything, pictures, the weird tubing, the whole setup. They were shocked, but they assured me they would investigate. As I left the area, I realized how much I had let my fear get to me. But in the end, the whole experience wasn't supernatural, wasn't a ghost or curse. It was just a sick, twisted setup designed to unsettle people, to make them feel like they were going crazy. The host had made sure the sound was just real enough to mess with you, but not enough to be able to explain it. I left with a weird sense of relief, but also with a lingering thought. Some people will do anything to manipulate fear. I was tired when I arrived at the Airbnb, feeling the weight of the long drive from the airport settle in. I had spent the last few days in meetings and networking, and all I wanted was to throw my bag on the bed, take a quick shower, and pass out. The pictures of the place online had made it look like a cozy little spot in a quiet neighborhood, just what I needed for a couple of nights to get away from everything. The host had left me detailed instructions on how to enter, along with a code for the front door. The keyless entry was a little impersonal, but I didn't mind. The place was clean, and it smelled faintly of lavender and wood. After unpacking a bit, I decided to grab a late dinner from the small restaurant just down the street. The city was quiet, and the air had that cool crispness that always made me feel like I was somewhere far away from my routine. I grabbed some takeout, returned to the apartment, and ate in front of the TV. The night was uneventful, just me zoning out, scrolling through my phone. Around 11:30 p.m., I turned off the lights and got into bed. It was one of those nights where sleep should have come easy, but my mind wouldn't settle. I kept replaying conversations from the day, going over the meetings, the small talk, the handshakes. The weight of it all was still hanging over me. I eventually drifted off, only to wake up suddenly. I wasn't sure what woke me. Maybe the silence. It was so quiet that it felt almost oppressive. My phone's screen glowed faintly on the bedside table, and the clock read 2 a.m. My eyes darted around the room, adjusting to the darkness. First, I thought I'd heard something. A noise? The faintest sound, like a knock, barely noticeable, but enough to make me sit up in bed. I lay still, listening for a second knock. Nothing came. It was just the silence again, thick and unsettling. I shook it off, telling myself it was probably just the house settling or maybe a car driving by outside. But then the knock came again. 3 quick raps. Solid. Hard. My heart started to race and I froze. I didn't want to move, didn't want to acknowledge it. What the hell was going on? I'd heard nothing. No one coming up the stairs. No footsteps in the hallway. This was a small building, the kind where you'd definitely hear someone walking around. I hadn't seen another soul since I'd arrived. For a moment, I was paralyzed, staring at the door, my mind going through all the possible scenarios. Could it be the host coming to check on something? I knew that wasn't it. She had left clear instructions for a self-check-in. The place was completely private. No one had mentioned a key exchange or any reason to come knocking at this hour. And I knew I hadn't ordered anything. I got up, my feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. I didn't even stop to think about the implications of opening the door at 2 a.m. I was just confused. My hand gripped the doorknob, cold under my fingers, and I pressed my eye to the peephole. And there it was, a figure. It was me, no kidding. Same jacket, same bag that I had checked in with, the same look I'd had when I first walked in, slightly hunched, like I was trying to keep my balance as I walked down the hallway. For a second, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was a prank, some kind of weird Airbnb joke. But no, this person, this version of me was standing there, staring straight ahead. Then they turned, just as I had when I'd first arrived. They looked down the hallway, just like I had when I'd gotten out of the elevator. It was uncanny. I blinked, twice, hard. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the sting, thinking maybe I was just exhausted or imagining things. But no, when I looked again, the hallway was completely empty. My mind raced. I stepped back from the door, still staring at the peephole like I could somehow will the figure to appear again. Nothing, no sound, no movement, just the eerie silence of the apartment building, which seemed to have grown even quieter in those few seconds. I pulled my phone off the bedside table, my fingers fumbling as I dialed the host's number, but then I stopped. What could I even say? I couldn't tell her someone was outside my door, someone who looked like me. I didn't even know what to make of it myself. Instead, I stood there, paralyzed by fear and confusion. I don't know how long I stood there, listening for anything out of the ordinary. Time seemed to stretch and twist, my mind spinning. I could feel my breath becoming shallow, my heart racing faster than it should. The quiet was too much. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, sitting on the edge of the bed, occasionally glancing at the door, still unsure of what to do. Every little sound, even the distant hum of traffic outside, seemed amplified in the stillness. But as the hours ticked by, nothing else happened. No more knocks, no other signs of movement. By the time morning came, I was exhausted. I'd barely slept, my eyes swollen from the lack of rest, my thoughts clouded with what had happened. I checked the peephole again in the daylight. Nothing. The hallway was empty, the same as it had been when I'd arrived. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened, something I couldn't explain. I debated leaving. Honestly, I considered it, but I couldn't put my finger on why I felt like I was supposed to leave, other than the overwhelming sense of unease. I'd booked the Airbnb for 2 nights, and I was already paying for it. I hadn't seen anything out of place, and everything else had been perfectly fine. There was no logical reason to leave, but I didn't sleep the next night either, and I didn't sleep the night after that. I spent the rest of my stay constantly on edge. Every time the wind rattled the windows, or I heard footsteps in the hall, my heart would race. I avoided looking at the hallway outside my door, kept the lights on in the room at all times, and made sure to double-check the lock before I went to bed. But the memory of what I'd seen, of seeing someone who looked exactly like me, stayed with me, gnawing at me in a way I couldn't explain. When I checked out, I didn't even bother to tell the host what had happened. I didn't want to sound crazy. What could I say? That someone who looked exactly like me had knocked on my door in the middle of the night and then disappeared? That would make anyone think I was out of my mind. So I just left, barely saying goodbye, and got into my car. I didn't want to think about it anymore. I drove home, my mind still buzzing with the question I couldn't answer. What had I seen that night? What had happened outside my door? I've tried to make sense of it since. I've talked it over with friends, but no one seems to have a good explanation. Some suggested maybe it was some sort of glitch in perception, a sleep-deprived hallucination, but that doesn't feel right. I was wide awake when I saw it, clear-headed, alert. I haven't been able to explain it, and I never will, but I've come to realize that the only thing that really matters is this. Sometimes, there are things that happen to us that we can't explain. And I don't know if I'll ever truly understand what happened that night, but I do know one thing for sure. I'll never stay in an Airbnb again without checking the peephole before I open the door. I arrived at the Airbnb after a long drive. It had been a busy week, and I was looking forward to a weekend of peace and relaxation in a small town I'd never been to before. The address was a little out of the way, but I didn't mind. The place was surrounded by woods, and the only sounds I could hear as I parked were the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was exactly what I needed. The house itself was a quaint two-story cottage, with ivy climbing up the walls and a small porch with a rocking chair. The front door was open when I arrived, and I could see the host waiting for me in the entryway. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with short, gray hair and glasses perched on the edge of her nose. She smiled warmly as I stepped up to the door. "Hello, welcome. I'm so glad you could make it," she said, her voice soft and welcoming. "I'm Martha. I've been looking forward to your stay." I introduced myself and she invited me inside. The place had an old-world charm to it, with wooden beams on the ceiling and vintage furniture that gave the whole house a cozy, lived-in feeling. It smelled faintly of lavender, and there was a small fireplace crackling in the corner of the living room. "I've prepared some tea for you," Martha said, gesturing toward the kitchen. "I know you've probably had a long trip. You must be tired. Would you like some tea before you settle in?" I nodded gratefully. I was exhausted, and the thought of sitting down with a cup of tea sounded like heaven. She led me into the kitchen, which had dark wooden cabinets and a large, antique-looking kettle sitting on the stove. There were fresh flowers on the table and a bowl of fruit next to the sink. Everything felt so clean and peaceful. Martha busied herself with pouring hot water into a mug and adding a bag of herbal tea, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she took care in everything she did. She handed me the steaming mug with a smile. "There you go. It's a blend I make myself. Very calming," she said. I took the mug and felt the warmth of it seep into my hands. It smelled sweet and floral, a perfect way to unwind after the drive. I thanked her and sat at the small table by the window, looking out at the wooded area that surrounded the house. The sun was starting to set, casting a warm glow over everything. I took a sip of the tea, and it was just as good as it smelled, soothing and rich with flavor. Martha sat across from me, and we chatted for a few minutes about the town and the sights nearby. She told me about some local trails to hike, a few hidden gems that only locals knew about, and a small cafe where I could get the best pastries. She was kind and full of stories about the area, and I found myself feeling comfortable in her presence. After a while, I finished my tea and thanked her again. I told her I was going to take a walk around the property to stretch my legs and get some fresh air. She smiled and nodded, telling me to enjoy my evening. I stepped outside, taking in the cool air as I wandered around the yard. The place was surrounded by trees, with a small path leading into the woods. The sound of rustling leaves and the occasional bird call made the place feel peaceful, almost like it was frozen in time. I walked around the perimeter of the yard, taking in the beauty of the place and feeling the stress of the past week slowly melt away. By the time I made my way back to the house, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky was fading to a deep purple. The house was quiet, and I could see Martha's car parked in the driveway. It was just her usual sedan, parked in the same spot she had parked it earlier. I went inside and set my bag down, heading toward the kitchen to grab a snack. I was starting to feel hungry, and there was a loaf of bread on the counter that I'd seen earlier. But as I walked through the house, something felt off. The house was too quiet. I hadn't heard Martha for a while. No sounds of footsteps, no creaking floorboards. I glanced around the living room, but she wasn't there. I figured she might be in her room, resting, but I decided to check in with her to thank her again for the tea and the lovely welcome. I walked upstairs to her room, my footsteps soft on the wooden floors. Her door was slightly ajar, and I knocked gently before pushing it open. But when I stepped inside, the room was empty. Her bed was made and everything looked in order. The window was open a crack, but there was no sign of her anywhere. I stood in the doorway, confused. It didn't make sense. I had just seen her not long ago. I checked the other rooms, thinking maybe she had just stepped out for a moment, but they were all as empty as the first. I went back downstairs and looked around again, calling out for her, but there was no answer. Her car was still parked outside, so she hadn't left. But where was she? I grabbed my phone and tried calling her. It rang several times before going straight to voicemail. That was strange. Maybe she had just stepped out for a minute. I decided to wait for a bit, but after a half hour had passed and there was still no sign of her, I started to feel uneasy. I walked outside to her car again, thinking maybe she had gone for a quick errand, but nothing had changed. The car was still there. The yard was silent, the air heavy with an odd sense of stillness. By this point, I was starting to feel a little concerned. Martha had seemed like such a kind, warm person, but her sudden disappearance didn't sit right with me. It wasn't like her to just leave without saying anything, especially after we had just had a pleasant conversation. I tried calling her again, but still no answer. Something wasn't adding up. I went back inside the house and started looking through the kitchen for any clues. Maybe she had left me a note or something to explain where she had gone. But there was nothing. The tea kettle was still on the stove, and it was still warm. I could feel the heat coming off of it as I walked by, which was strange because I hadn't heard it whistling since I first arrived. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the fact that she was gone. It was the way everything was left behind so suddenly, like she had just vanished without a trace. I checked her phone number again and dialed it once more. Voicemail again. I was starting to feel anxious now, pacing around the house, my mind racing. Where was she? What had happened? Had something happened to her? I thought about calling the police, but that felt extreme. It didn't seem like anything that would warrant that kind of response. But still, the longer I stood there, the more unsettled I became. The night stretched on, and there was still no sign of Martha. I ended up locking all the doors and staying up late, half waiting for her to return, but she never did. I fell asleep on the couch, the quiet of the house weighing heavily on me. The next morning, I woke up to the sounds of birds chirping outside. It was bright, and the house felt even emptier than it had the night before. I tried calling Martha's number again, but it went to voicemail once more. I stayed there for another day, hoping she would return, but she never did. No messages, no calls, nothing. I ended up leaving that evening, feeling more disturbed than I cared to admit. As I pulled out of the driveway, I couldn't help but glance at the house one last time. It looked as peaceful and quiet as it had when I first arrived. But inside, something had changed. I'd never find out what had happened to Martha or why she had left so suddenly. It would remain a mystery, a lingering question I would never have an answer to. And I couldn't shake the feeling that, in some strange way, she had never really been there at all. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A quiet weekend getaway to an Airbnb tucked away in a small town, far from the noise and chaos of the city. I had seen the listing online, and it seemed perfect. An old but well-kept house with a rustic charm, surrounded by nature. The reviews were mostly positive, with a few mentioning how peaceful and serene the area was. It sounded like exactly what I needed after weeks of back-to-back work. So, I booked it without hesitation. The drive up was beautiful. The kind of drive where the sun filters through the trees and the landscape looks like something straight out of a painting. The house itself was situated on a quiet street with only a few neighbors around, the kind of place where everyone keeps to themselves. I pulled up the gravel driveway and parked next to the front porch, admiring the quaint little house. I grabbed my suitcase from the car and made my way to the front door. The house was a 2-story building with a small porch at the front, and the air was thick with the smell of old wood and pine trees. The host had left a key under the mat, so I let myself in. The interior was cozy, decorated with mismatched furniture and vintage touches that made it feel like a home, not a rental. I took a deep breath, savoring the silence. It was exactly what I needed. I started unpacking my things, putting my clothes away and setting up my little space for the weekend. As I was unloading my suitcase, I heard footsteps outside. I looked up and saw a man standing at the end of the driveway, looking at me. He was tall, with a weathered face, his clothes old and worn. At first, I thought he might be one of the neighbors, just out for a walk. But when he took a few steps toward the house, I felt a strange unease settle in my stomach. He stopped just a few feet away from the porch, glanced over his shoulder as if making sure no one else was around, and then walked up to me. I didn't know what to expect, but I didn't think I'd get the words he spoke next. "Be careful. This place, bad things happen here," he said in a low, almost conspiratorial tone. His voice was quiet, but the way he said it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stared at him, trying to make sense of what he meant. I'd seen the reviews. The place was perfectly normal, wasn't it? "What do you mean? What kind of bad things?" I asked, trying to sound calm. He didn't answer me. Instead, he just shook his head slowly, his eyes darting nervously around, then turned and walked away without another word. It was as if he had said what he needed to say and now wanted nothing more than to leave. He didn't even make eye contact as he turned around and disappeared behind a row of trees. I stood there for a moment, the air suddenly feeling colder. Maybe it was just some weird local superstition, I thought. I wasn't the type to get spooked easily, and I figured the guy was just a little off. I shrugged it off, though I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had crept into my chest. I didn't think much more about it and went back inside, trying to focus on relaxing. That night, I settled in comfortably. I made myself a simple dinner, watched a couple of shows on the couch, and then took a long, relaxing bath. By the time I got into bed, it was well past midnight. The silence around the house was absolute. No traffic, no people, just the sound of my own breathing. I loved it, but as I lay there in the dark, trying to drift off, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Pacing, soft but unmistakable. Above me, my heart skipped a beat. I was certain I heard footsteps, the slow, rhythmic sound of someone walking back and forth across the floor. It was coming from directly above me, from what should have been an empty second floor. I froze, listening intently. Maybe it was just the house settling, right? Houses creak all the time, but this didn't sound like creaking. It was too deliberate, too consistent. It sounded like someone walking in circles, back and forth, up and down the hall upstairs. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. But the more I listened, the more unsettling it became. The pacing continued for what felt like hours, and with every step, my unease grew. It wasn't normal. I knew it wasn't normal. I got out of bed and stood in the middle of the room, staring up at the ceiling. My thoughts were racing. The host had said the upstairs was vacant, and I hadn't seen anyone else in the house. But someone was up there, walking around, as if they were waiting for something, or maybe someone. I didn't know what to do. I considered calling the host, but then I remembered the man from next door, what he had said. Bad things happen here. Was he right? Was I in danger? I stayed awake for hours, listening to the pacing above me. Every time I thought it might stop, it would start again, slow and deliberate, like a slow, methodical rhythm. And I began to feel like the house was pressing in on me, like it was alive in some way, watching me, waiting. Eventually, the pacing stopped. It didn't fade out. It just stopped. Silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence. The kind that feels too quiet, like the air is too thick to breathe. I didn't sleep a wink that night. When morning finally came, I got up as soon as the first light peeked through the curtains. I packed my things in a daze, my mind still racing with what I had heard. I couldn't stay there any longer. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the man's warning hadn't been a fluke. I left the keys on the table by the door, not bothering to lock it behind me. I just wanted to get out. I walked out of the house into the cold morning air, and as I stood there on the front porch, I looked at the quiet street around me. The neighbors were all still inside. The world felt still, like nothing had happened the night before. I thought I had imagined the whole thing. The pacing, the unease, but deep down I knew I hadn't. I'd heard it, and I would never forget it. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove away. I didn't look back. The whole drive home, I kept thinking about that man's warning. Bad things happen here. What did he mean by that? What had happened in that house? I didn't know, and honestly, I didn't want to know. I didn't stay at another Airbnb after that. I couldn't bring myself to, and though I tried to push the memory of that night away, the feeling of someone pacing above me, just out of sight, still haunts me. I'll never understand what was really going on in that house. But one thing is for sure, I'll never go back. The apartment was spotless. I couldn't help but admire the way the light reflected off the freshly polished floors, the way everything was arranged so neatly. It was a relief to finally be settled in after a long drive. I had been looking forward to this Airbnb stay for a while. The host had been very communicative and seemed like a genuinely nice person, which was reassuring, especially after my experiences with some less than ideal places in the past. The apartment was small but cozy, located in a quiet neighborhood in a city I had never visited before. I was only going to be here for 2 nights, but it felt like the perfect spot to get some rest before continuing my trip. The living room was the first place I noticed when I walked in. It had a clean, modern feel to it, with a plush couch facing a small TV on a stand. The coffee table was made of dark wood, and there was a large rug in the center of the room. The rug caught my attention because it was slightly out of place. It wasn't the color or pattern that was strange. It was the dark red stain that marred its otherwise pristine surface. It was large, maybe a foot in diameter, and its edges were jagged, as if the stain had been there for a while. It wasn't the first thing you noticed when you walked in, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. I tried to ignore it at first, but my curiosity got the better of me. I had to ask the host about it. I wasn't sure if it was wine, paint, or something more sinister, but whatever it was, it made me uncomfortable. It's hard to explain, but there was something about the way it looked, like it had been deliberately hidden under the rug, as if it didn't belong there. I grabbed my phone and sent the host a quick message, asking about the stain. His response came almost immediately. He said, "Don't worry, it's been handled." That response sent a chill down my spine. The way he phrased it felt off. There was something oddly vague about it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was trying to brush off a question he wasn't comfortable answering. It's been handled. What did that mean? Handled how? My mind started racing, and I immediately began imagining all sorts of worst-case scenarios. Maybe it was just a nosebleed, or perhaps it was something more serious. Maybe someone had spilled something and tried to clean it up but left a stain behind. Or maybe it was something worse. I tried to push the thought out of my head. I was being paranoid, right? It was just a stain, but I couldn't help it. I had seen enough true crime shows to know that stains like that could sometimes be a sign of something much darker. The more I thought about it, the worse it got. My mind kept going back to that vague response. It's been handled. It didn't sound like someone who had cleaned up a simple mess. It sounded like someone who was trying to cover up something, trying to make sure no one asked too many questions. The longer I stayed in the apartment, the more my anxiety grew. I kept glancing at the stain under the rug, half expecting it to somehow grow, to somehow reveal more about its origins. Couldn't relax. The apartment, which had seemed so comforting and welcoming when I first walked in, now felt suffocating. The silence in the air was oppressive, and I kept hearing tiny creaks in the floorboards, as if something was moving around just out of sight. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're alone in a room that's been vacant for too long, when every little noise makes you jump. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. Maybe some fresh air would help. But as soon as I stepped outside, the weight of the apartment seemed to lift slightly. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. I walked for a while, trying to distract myself from the thoughts that kept creeping into my mind. But no matter how much I tried to calm myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I returned to the apartment, I almost expected the stain to have changed in some way, but it hadn't. It was still there, under the rug, hidden but not quite hidden enough. I decided to sit down on the couch and watch some TV to take my mind off of it. I managed to relax for a while, but the nagging thought wouldn't leave me. I started pacing around the apartment, checking the locks on the doors and the windows, making sure everything was secure. It wasn't that I thought anyone would break in. It was just that I felt watched. It was a feeling I couldn't explain. The night stretched on, and I eventually forced myself to sleep. I kept the lights on in the bedroom, even though I knew it was silly, but I couldn't bring myself to turn them off. I woke up in the middle of the night, sweating and disoriented, with the strange feeling that something had changed in the apartment. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, but I felt like the walls were closing in on me. I glanced over at the rug, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move beneath it. I quickly turned my head, blinking hard to clear my vision, but when I looked back, everything seemed normal. I was being paranoid, that's all. It was just my imagination. The next morning, I woke up early. I was exhausted from not sleeping well, but I didn't want to spend another night in that apartment. The stain under the rug, the vague response from the host, the feeling of being watched. It was all too much. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I packed my bags quickly, trying not to think about the strange things that had happened. The apartment seemed different in the daylight, less oppressive but still unsettling. I grabbed my phone and sent the host a message, letting him know I was checking out early. He didn't respond right away, which only made me feel more on edge. I left the keys on the kitchen counter and locked the door behind me, taking one last look at the apartment as I stepped out into the hallway. I didn't feel any sense of relief, though. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something important, something that I was never supposed to know. I could only hope that I had gotten out of there in time, before whatever had happened in that apartment found its way back. As I drove away, I tried to push the thoughts from my mind, but no matter how far I went, I couldn't stop thinking about that stain, the one under the rug. I kept wondering if it was ever really handled, or if it had been something worse that had been covered up. Maybe I'd never know the truth. Maybe it was better that way. But one thing was for sure, I would never stay in another Airbnb without asking more questions first. It was my first solo trip. I'd been talking about it for years, daydreaming about getting away on my own, just to clear my head. No big travel plans or luxury getaway, just a couple of quiet nights to myself in a different town. I didn't want anything fancy, just a place to sleep, some peace and quiet, and maybe a chance to reset. I picked a small town a few hours from where I lived, nothing too far, but far enough that I wouldn't be running into anyone I knew. I booked a room through Airbnb, something cheap. The listing said it was a cozy private room with separate entrance. The photos looked decent, nothing special, just a clean bed, a small desk, a window with blinds, and a little bathroom with a sink and shower. The host had decent reviews, all short and to the point. Clean place, quiet neighborhood, stuff like that. No red flags. The house was in a residential neighborhood, one of those older suburban areas where every house looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. Still, it didn't seem sketchy or run down. Just quiet. A little too quiet. I pulled up in the late afternoon, around 5 p.m. The sun was still out, and the street was dead silent. I parked out front and followed the instructions the host sent me in the app. Walk around the side gate, follow the path to the back, and the guest entrance would be on the left side of the house. The door was a standard white door with a keypad lock. I punched in the code, and it opened right away. The The entrance led into a small hallway, maybe 8 feet long, with a door to the bathroom on the right and the bedroom at the end. The bedroom was basic but clean. The bed was made, the sheets looked washed, and there was a small dresser and a nightstand with a lamp. A ceiling fan spun slowly overhead. I noticed the closet right away. It was a sliding door closet, one of those cheap hollow ones. The left door was closed, the right side slightly ajar. I walked over and pulled it open just to check. Empty. Just a couple of hangers and a stack of extra blankets. Nothing unusual. I unpacked my small bag and tossed it on the dresser. I checked the locks, something I always do when I stay anywhere new. The main door locked fine from the inside. The bathroom had a deadbolt too. There was no connecting door to the rest of the house that I could see. I figured maybe the walls were thick or the host just kept to himself. I hadn't seen him when I arrived. He messaged me earlier saying he'd be home later in the evening, but that I shouldn't need anything. That was fine with me. I wasn't there to make friends. I spent the evening walking around the town. I got dinner at a little diner off the main street, had a coffee afterward, and browsed a thrift shop before heading back. The streets were empty by 9 p.m. It had that weird small-town stillness to it. Nothing happening, no cars going by, no people walking around, just dead quiet. By 10:30, I was back in the room. I showered, read for a bit in bed, and turned off the lights a little after 11. I laid there for a while, half awake, listening to the distant sound of crickets outside. No traffic, no music, no voices, just quiet. At some point, I heard something, a soft whispering sound. At first, I thought it might be outside, maybe someone walking by the side of the house. But the sound didn't move. It stayed low and steady, like someone whispering just beneath their breath. Too soft to make out the words, but enough to know it was a voice. I sat up in bed and listened. It stopped. I waited. Nothing. Maybe it was in my head. Maybe the old house made weird sounds at night. I've stayed in enough rentals to know that old pipes, AC units, and weird layouts can make all kinds of strange noises. I reached over and turned the lamp back on, just to feel a little more normal. The room looked the same. The closet doors were still shut. I turned on the bathroom light, checked in there. Nothing. Still, something didn't feel right. I sat back down on the bed. The whispering started again, but this time it was closer, inside. I turned the lamp off, my heart thudding in my chest. I don't know why I turned it off. Maybe I thought I'd see something better in the dark, or maybe I didn't want to be seen. I held my breath, and that's when I saw the closet door slowly slide open. Just a few inches, enough to see the outline of someone standing inside. He stepped out slowly, no rush, like he didn't care if I saw him. A man, average height, maybe late 30s or early 40s. He wore jeans and a black hoodie. I didn't see his face clearly, just the shape of it in the dark. I screamed. I didn't think, I just screamed, as loud as I could. I scrambled backwards over the bed and hit the wall. He bolted, not towards me, but to the door, the front door. He yanked it open and ran out into the night. I stood there shaking, heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I locked the door again, deadbolt, knob, everything. I turned on every light. I didn't even care that I was probably waking up the host. I checked the closet. Empty, completely empty, like he had never been there. But I knew what I saw. I didn't know what to do. It was past midnight. I didn't know the town and I didn't want to go outside. I sat on the edge of the bed for what felt like forever before finally texting the host. I told him what happened, just the basics, that a man was in the closet and ran out the front door. He replied about 15 minutes later, saying he had no idea who that could have been, and that he was sorry for the scare. That was it. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the chair in the corner, eyes fixed on the closet. I kept the lights on. At some point, the sun started coming up. I packed my stuff fast. I didn't even shower. I walked straight out to my car, drove into town, and got a coffee at the first gas station I could find. I sat there in the parking lot, just staring at my coffee, thinking it over. I kept replaying everything. The whispering, the closet, the way he moved. So calm, so quiet. like he had been there for a while just waiting, like he knew the layout, knew how to stay quiet enough to go unnoticed. That's what stuck with me the most. The silence. He didn't say anything, didn't scream or threaten or try to grab me, just stood there and left, like it wasn't meant to go that far. I messaged Airbnb and reported it. I didn't write a review. I didn't want to deal with it anymore. I told them what happened, sent the screenshots of my messages with the host, and then deleted the app off my phone. They refunded me the second night. That was it. I didn't tell many people about it when I got home. I wasn't sure what to even say. Some didn't believe me. Others said maybe it was someone the host knew. A friend? A relative? A tenant who thought the room was empty. But that didn't make sense to me. He didn't try to explain himself. Didn't say anything. He ran. Fast. That kind of fear doesn't come from someone making a mistake. That's someone who knew they were caught. I still think about it sometimes. That quiet voice in the middle of the night. That slow movement from the dark corner of the room. It made me second-guess every sound I hear now when I stay somewhere new. I double-check every lock, every window, every closet. I haven't booked an Airbnb since, and I haven't traveled solo again. That trip was supposed to be about getting away, finding peace, starting something new for myself. But I came back feeling smaller than ever, like I'd brushed up against something I wasn't supposed to see. Something that wasn't meant for me, but could have been if I hadn't woken up, if I hadn't screamed. The weirdest part? I never found out how he got in. The guest door locks from both sides, and I double-checked it when I arrived. The windows were all locked. The closet had no back panel, no crawl space, no hidden door. He had to already be inside. He was probably in that closet when I arrived. Maybe before I even unlocked the door. Just standing there, waiting, watching, silent. That's the part one can't shake. How long he was in there. How close I came to never knowing he was there at all. I booked the cabin because I needed a break. I'd been working non-stop for months and just wanted a few days away from city noise, traffic, and people. I searched Airbnb and came across a place listed as a modern mountain retreat. The photos were beautiful, wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a wide valley, sleek kitchen, stone fireplace. It had great reviews, too. Everyone said the view was worth every penny, and the host was responsive and helpful. That was enough for me. I drove up on a Friday morning. The road twisted through thick pine forest for miles before opening up to rolling ridgelines and jagged mountains in the distance. When I finally got there, the driveway was a steep gravel curve, with tall trees on either side. The cabin sat on the edge of a small cliff, maybe 40 feet down to the forest below. It looked exactly like the pictures, maybe even better. The deck wrapped all the way around. Inside, it smelled like fresh wood and pine cleaner. Everything was clean, cleaner than I expected. Not a speck of dust on the windowsills, no crumbs in the kitchen drawers, not even a smudge on the faucets. Spotless. Some people would love that. I just noticed it. There was a keypad on the front door, no key. The welcome book on the counter had all the usual stuff: Wi-Fi password, emergency numbers, checkout instructions. I set my bags down and walked around the place. There was a cozy reading nook next to the fireplace. The kitchen had every modern appliance you could want, all spotless stainless steel. The living room looked straight out to the valley through a massive window wall. Upstairs was a loft-style bedroom with a king bed. The bathroom was big, modern, with a rain shower and heated floor tiles. I didn't think anything was off at first. The first night, I made dinner, read on the deck, and watched the sun go down behind the ridgeline. It was cold by the time it got dark, so I lit a fire and sat on the couch scrolling through my phone. There wasn't much signal, but the Wi-Fi worked fine. I felt relaxed for the first time in a while. That night, I fell asleep to the sound of wind pushing through the trees. No traffic, no sirens, just wind and a distant owl or two. The next morning, I noticed something small. I was brushing my teeth and saw a faint red light through the bathroom vent. At first, I thought it was a reflection. I moved my head, but the light didn't shift. It was faint, about the size of a pinhead, blinking very slowly, on, off, on, off. It was weird, but I didn't think much of it yet. I told myself it was probably some kind of sensor like a motion detector or smoke alarm. But the vent? I crouched and looked in through the slats. I couldn't see much, it was too dark and too deep, but I saw something metallic just past the grill. I didn't touch it. I just stood there for a while, toothbrush in hand, staring at it. Later, while making coffee, I noticed another one, this time in the living room. Same kind of vent, near the ceiling. Same blinking red light. Now I felt that slow rise of unease. 2 devices, both in vents, both blinking. That's when I started checking every room. I went room to room with my phone flashlight, looking into every vent I could find. There were 4 total. Every single one of them had the same blinking red light tucked behind the slats. I still didn't know what they were for sure, but deep down I knew what they looked like. Cameras. Small, hidden, and out of reach. I didn't panic. Not yet. I pulled over a chair and stood on it in the bathroom. The vent was just high enough to reach. I used a key from my car keychain to remove the screws. They came out easily, like someone had taken the grill off recently. Inside was a tiny device, black and cylindrical, about the size of a thumb. It had a small lens on the front and a thin red wire snaking deeper into the vent shaft. The blinking light came from a small indicator next to the lens. It was a camera, no doubt about it. I felt sick. I stood there for a long time staring at it. My skin was cold even though the floor was still warm from the heater. Then I pulled the vent cover back on and taped over it with a few layers of duct tape I found under the sink. I did the same thing in the other rooms. I didn't touch the cameras, just covered them. The thought of someone possibly watching me through them made my skin crawl. I sat on the couch and tried to process what was happening. I kept going over what I'd done in the last 24 hours. Where I walked, what I wore, what I said out loud. I couldn't remember if I'd left the bathroom door open. I couldn't remember how long I'd stood in front of the mirror. I didn't feel safe. The worst part was not knowing if someone was watching in real time or if it was all recorded somewhere. I didn't know if the place was monitored or if someone was planning to watch it later. I felt exposed, like I was being hunted. I didn't sleep that night. I left the lights on and kept the fireplace going just for some kind of comfort. Every time the wind pushed against the cabin, I tensed. Every time a branch creaked outside, I thought someone was walking around. The next morning, I messaged the host through the Airbnb app. I didn't say much, just that I had questions about some electronics in the vents. I didn't accuse him. I wanted to see what he'd say. He responded a few hours later. His message was polite, a little too casual. He said he didn't know what I was talking about and assured me the cabin had no surveillance of any kind. I took pictures. I recorded short videos of the blinking lights. I didn't remove the devices. I didn't want to be accused of damaging anything, but I made sure to document everything I could without tampering. I also ran a scan using a hidden camera detector app one downloaded. It pinged red in every spot I already suspected, and a couple more near light fixtures. That afternoon, I packed up early. I didn't want to spend another night there. I taped over everything I found and made sure the front door was locked behind me. As I drove down the mountain, I kept checking my rearview mirror. I kept expecting someone to follow me. Nobody did. Still, I felt watched the whole way down. When I got home, I reported everything to Airbnb. I uploaded the photos and videos. I described the devices, the placement, the red lights, the host's response. They said they would investigate. Took about a week, but then the listing was gone. Not booked up, not unavailable, just gone. I never got a follow-up from Airbnb about what they found. Just a message saying they took the matter seriously and thanked me for bringing it to their attention. That was it. No real closure. For a while after, I felt paranoid at home. I covered the vents in my own house. I checked every room for hidden lights before getting dressed. I even bought a physical RF scanner just to be sure. I never figured out what the cameras were connected to. I never found out if they were live streaming or recording. I don't know who watched the footage or why. Maybe it was the host. Maybe it was someone who had access before him. Maybe it was just a sick setup meant to capture guests without them knowing. All I know is that someone hid cameras in a place meant to feel safe. Someone wanted to watch strangers, and they almost got away with it. It didn't ruin traveling for me, but it changed the way I do it. Now, every time I walk into a hotel or an Airbnb, the first thing I do isn't unpack. It's check the vents, check the smoke detectors, check the outlets, check the mirrors, look for lights, scan the room, even if it feels crazy. Because once you see it, once you know what's possible, it's hard to go back to pretending you're alone. I booked a quaint little cottage in upstate New York for a solo weekend getaway. I'd been buried in work and needed something quiet, something isolated. The listing had caught my attention because it looked cozy and simple. White siding, green shutters, and surrounded by thick trees. It looked like the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. That's what I wanted, something peaceful. No people, no noise, just stillness. The drive out there took longer than I expected. The final stretch was a winding, single-lane road that cut through thick woods. There were no streetlights, and the GPS had trouble keeping up. It was already getting dark by the time I pulled up the gravel driveway. The cottage sat a few hundred feet off the road, shielded by trees and backed by more woods. The porch light was on, probably set on a timer. It gave off a soft glow that made the place look even more inviting. A few birds fluttered around in the trees nearby, and the woods had that late summer smell, dry leaves, soil, and something slightly sweet. Inside was even better. The air was clean. The furniture was old, but in a nice way, like a grandmother's house. There was a small kitchen, a worn leather chair by the window, a little bookshelf filled with old paperbacks, and a fireplace with a basket of wood beside it. The bedroom was small, just a bed, a dresser, and a tall mirror mounted on the wall across from the bed. The place had a slight musty smell, but nothing bad, just old wood and dust. I unpacked a few things, made myself a sandwich, and watched the last light disappear through the window. That first night, I went to bed early. I thought I'd sleep like a rock, but I kept waking up. I don't wear a watch, but I checked my phone every time I stirred. Around 11:42 p.m., then 12:51, then 2:08. It went like that all night. I couldn't fall into a deep sleep. I wasn't having nightmares, and there weren't any obvious sounds waking me up. But every time I opened my eyes, I had this tight feeling in my chest, like I was being stared at, not just watched. *watch star. I'd glance at the window, thinking maybe someone was outside, but the curtains were closed. I thought about the woods, how close they were, but that didn't quite feel like it. It felt like someone was closer than that. At one point, I sat up and looked around. The room was dimly lit from the porch light seeping through the thin curtains. I could make out the edges of the dresser, the door frame, and the mirror. That mirror, I didn't think anything of it before, but now I felt like it was the only thing in the room that didn't belong. It was large, maybe 5 feet tall and about 2 wide, framed in thick dark wood. It looked heavy, too heavy to be just loosely hung. I got out of bed, walked over, and looked at myself for a moment. I looked tired. My eyes were puffy. My face looked slightly pale, like I was coming down with something. I touched the mirror and noticed it shifted slightly, just enough to feel wrong. I pressed on the edge and it gave a little, like it wasn't mounted tight. Still, I told myself to stop being paranoid. It was an old place. Things creaked, things were loose, wood shifted. I got back in bed and eventually, near sunrise, I must have drifted off for an hour or two. The next morning, I felt groggy and slow. My head throbbed like I'd had too much wine, though I hadn't even opened the bottle I brought. I drank 2 glasses of water and made coffee with the old drip machine. The woods outside were silent, not just quiet, dead silent. No wind, no birds. Even the trees looked still, like they were holding their breath. As I walked around the cottage, something kept tugging at me. That mirror, I hadn't let it go, kept popping into my head, like a splinter under the skin. I couldn't stop thinking about the way it moved when I touched it. After breakfast, I walked back into the bedroom. The light was better now, sun pouring through the curtains. I looked at the mirror again. This time, I touched the top edge and tried to lift it slightly. It moved. Not a lot, but it shifted like it was hooked onto something rather than screwed in. My curiosity took over. I took a step stool from the hall closet and gently lifted the mirror up and off the wall mounts. Behind it, the wall was wrong. There was no drywall, no insulation, just a rectangle cut clean through the wall, maybe 2 feet wide, 4 feet tall. Not big, but large enough for someone to fit through if they crouched. I stood there for several seconds, not really understanding what I was seeing. My first thought was that maybe it was an access panel, something for plumbing or wiring. But it was too clean, too deliberate. The edges were rough but not accidental. It looked like someone had cut into the wall on purpose. I grabbed the flashlight from my duffel and pointed it into the hole. It was a crawl space, narrow, dusty, with old insulation and wooden beams. But it wasn't empty. There were signs someone had been in there. A crushed water bottle, a few torn wrappers, and a piece of what looked like a blanket shoved to the side. I leaned closer and saw footprints. Not just dust marks, real prints smudged into the insulation. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. I could see toe outlines. That's when it hit me. Someone had been behind that mirror. Not years ago, not months ago. Recently. I backed up. My mouth was dry, and my hands were shaking a little. This wasn't an old forgotten space. This was used, lived in. I scanned the rest of the room, suddenly aware of every crack, every shadow. The silence outside felt heavier now. I turned off the flashlight, grabbed my bag, and walked straight out of the house. I didn't run. I didn't want to panic, but I moved fast. I threw my stuff in the car, turned it on, and drove. I didn't even look back at the cottage. I didn't want to see the windows. I didn't want to wonder if someone was inside watching me leave. I drove until I hit a gas station near a main road, maybe 30 minutes out. I parked, sat there for a long time, and tried to calm down. My phone buzzed with notifications I'd missed overnight. I had service again. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? There was a crawl space behind a mirror. Someone might have been living in the wall. Still, I did call. I gave them the address and told them what I found. They took the report seriously enough, asked me a few questions, and said they'd send someone to check it out. I never heard back. I didn't follow up. Later that night, in a hotel room with clean sheets and working locks, I opened the listing on Airbnb to report it. The cottage was gone. No trace. The host profile was gone too. No reviews. No booking history. Like it never existed. I don't know who was behind that mirror. I don't want to know. Maybe it was someone passing through. Maybe someone who knew that place wasn't checked often. Maybe the host knew. Maybe they didn't. But I think about it sometimes. How quiet that place was. How dead the air felt. How I kept waking up like someone was watching me. And how the mirror was hung just right. High enough that you wouldn't think to touch it, but not so tight it couldn't be moved. That wasn't an accident. I've stayed in a few AIRBNBs since then. I always check behind every mirror now. Every one. I booked the Airbnb because I needed a place to stay during a 3-day work trip in a small town I'd never been to before. It was cheaper than the hotels nearby, and honestly, I liked the idea of staying somewhere that felt more like a home. The pictures showed a quiet 2-story house with a private guest room upstairs, a small bathroom, and a little kitchenette. It looked clean and well lit. Nothing fancy, but fine for what I needed. The description said the owner lived on the main floor, and the basement was a private area not accessible to guests. That didn't raise any red flags for me. Most hosts keep some areas private, and it was just a basement. No big deal. I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. The host had sent me the code to the keypad lock. There was no in-person check-in, just a note on the counter welcoming me and reminding me to keep the front door locked after 9 p.m. She also said to contact her through the Airbnb app if I needed anything. I dropped my bag in the guest room and took a quick look around. Everything matched the photos. Clean sheets, towels folded neatly, coffee and tea in a basket by the little microwave. The fridge was empty except for a few bottles of water. I had work to catch up on. so I sat at the little desk by the window and got started. The first night passed uneventfully, at least until around 3 in the morning. I had gone to bed around 11. The bed was fine, stiff but not uncomfortable. I remember waking up to what I thought was the sound of footsteps, not upstairs or outside, but below me, the basement. I lay there, eyes open in the dark, listening. They were slow, steady footsteps, just a few at first, then a pause, then more. I kept telling myself it was probably the house settling or maybe the host going down there for something. But it was 3 a.m., and something about the rhythm didn't feel like someone casually grabbing something from storage. It felt deliberate, like someone was walking in circles. I turned on the lamp beside the bed and sat there for a bit, waiting to hear more, but the sound stopped. I didn't go back to sleep for another hour. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I got dressed, made some instant coffee, and headed out for my meetings. The day was long, and by the time I got back, I was too tired to think about anything. I heated up some food I'd picked up and ate alone at the little kitchen counter. I texted my girlfriend back home and told her the place was fine. Nothing special but clean and quiet. I went to bed earlier that night around 10. Slept hard for the first few hours. Then, right around 3 a.m. again, I woke up. This time, I didn't even know why I woke up until I heard the sound again. Footsteps. Same as before, slow, heavy, measured. Like someone pacing. I sat up and held my breath. It didn't sound like it was directly under my room this time. More like in a different part of the basement, moving across from one wall to another. A few steps, then a pause. Then again. This time I leaned over and turned off the fan I had running beside the bed. I wanted to be sure I wasn't imagining it. The sound was still there. A faint creaking of floor joists and what sounded like boots on concrete. I got up, quietly padded across the room, and opened the door. The hallway was dark, but moonlight came through the window at the end. I moved slowly, trying not to make noise, and stood at the top of the stairs that led down to the main floor. From there, I could see the door to the basement. It was closed, but as I watched it, I thought I saw the knob move. Not a full turn, just a twitch, like someone lightly touched it from the other side. I stared, not moving. The footsteps had stopped. I backed up into the room, shut the door, and locked it. I didn't know what to think. Was the host going down there at 3 a.m.? Was someone else staying in the basement? I hadn't seen or heard anyone else. And if it was the host, why would she try to come upstairs? I waited until sunrise before I got any more sleep. The next morning, I looked at the listing again. There were only about a dozen reviews. Most people said it was quiet and clean, a good place for a short stay. But one review stood out, buried near the bottom. It said something like, "Heard footsteps from the basement at night. Kind of freaked me out." No reply from the host. Another review, a month or two older, said, "Felt like someone was in the basement while I stayed. Made it hard to sleep. Otherwise fine." Again, no response from the host. That should have been enough for me to leave, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was just the host moving around down there. Maybe she worked night shifts or something. I told myself I'd finish my last night and check out early. That third night, I barely slept. I kept the lamp on. I left my clothes and shoes by the bed, ready in case I needed to leave quickly. I set my phone to record audio and left it running on the nightstand. Right on cue, around 3:04 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time they were faster, heavier, not just pacing, but walking from one side of the basement to the other, then stopping directly beneath me. The floor creaked, then silence, and then the door handle rattled. Not gently, not accidentally, jiggled hard, like someone was trying to open it from the inside. I froze. I didn't make a sound. I stared at the bedroom door, which was locked, and listened. The handle stopped. Another pause, then 3 hard knocks. Not on my door, on the basement door. That was it. I grabbed my phone, stopped the recording, and hit call on the host's number listed in the app. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. I left a short message. "Hi, I'm staying at your place. Someone's trying to come out of the basement. Please call me back." No reply. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept expecting to hear footsteps on the stairs, the front door opening, anything, but the house stayed quiet. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my stuff, walked down the stairs, and left through the front door. I didn't bother locking it behind me. I got in my car and drove to the nearest gas station, where I sat for a while and just tried to process what the hell had happened. Back home, I checked the recording I made that night. It wasn't great quality, but I could hear it. Steps, creaks, and the sharp sound of the handle rattling. It wasn't in my head. Later, I checked the Airbnb listing again. A few more reviews had been posted since my stay. One of them mentioned strange sounds from the basement. Another said they left early because it didn't feel safe. Still no replies from the host. I reported the listing to Airbnb. I wrote a detailed review, leaving out anything that could be brushed off as imagination. I just listed the facts. Heard footsteps 3 nights in a row, heard the basement door handle jiggle, called the host. No answer, left early. I added that I had a recording of the noise in case anyone wanted to verify it. A week later, the listing was still up. It's not like I expected Airbnb to shut it down based on one complaint, but it bothered me. It still does. I don't know who or what was down there. Could have been the host, maybe sleepwalking. Maybe someone she let stay down there who wasn't supposed to. Maybe someone was squatting without her knowledge. But none of those answers explain why she never responded. Not to my call, not to any of the reviews. I don't rent AIRBNBs anymore, at least not private homes. I stick to hotels now. I want a front desk, staff, other people around. I want to know that if something happens at 3 in the morning, I won't be completely alone. I never did get a call back. Not from the host. Not from Airbnb. My review is still there, near the bottom now. But I check sometimes, and every so often, someone new leaves a similar story. Footsteps, late at night, from the basement, and still no reply.